Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. As Canada prepares to observe the 4th Annual National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, we're checking in with Indigenous nonprofit leaders from across the country about what, if any, progress has been made when it comes to how the wider nonprofit sector supports, funds, and collaborates with Indigenous-led organizations. Are legislative changes to how charities can work with non-qualified donees making a difference? Are Canadian foundations doing a better job of ensuring more funding dollars go to Indigenous-led groups? Joining me today to discuss these important issues is Tim Fox, a member of the Blackfoot Confederacy from the Blood Reserve. As Vice President of Indigenous Relations and Equity Strategy with the Calgary Foundation, Tim supports the work of philanthropy while also facilitating an internal systems change approach. His efforts help to strengthen and enhance the culture and practice of the foundation while designing ways of mobilizing reconciliation internally and in the broader community. Tim co-chairs the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada Board of Directors and was recently named a top 40 under 40 for his efforts of incorporating reconciliation and decolonization. Welcome back to CharityVillage Connects, Tim.
Thanks for having me back.
Well, it's been a couple of years since we last interviewed you for the podcast. Can you give us a little insight into what's changed since then in terms of your work with the Calgary Foundation? Any new projects or initiatives you'd like to share with our audience?
Yeah, well, I'm just trying to reflect on the last 2 years, but I think what really stands out for me from an external perspective, sorry, when I say external perspective, I mean things that were happening outside of our work at the Calgary Foundation, outside of this charitable work, was that really profound, significant visit by the Pope a couple of summers ago, where he, issued this public apology to residential school survivors. And I believe that was the main focus of his trip, of his pilgrimage up here to Canada. It was really significant because, that was when we talk about things surrounding the truth and reconciliation. And I think when we are trying to call the community in, call the charitable organizations that we do to do things a little bit differently, and that our shared history was very strategically designed. A big piece of that was because of the Catholic Church's involvement in the residential school system. So there's still even today, probably moving forward, lots of healing that has to happen from a community perspective. That stands out to me big time, because what I think is happening is these charities, the rest of Canadian society, are seeing all of these things develop, these visits happening, and there's the lens is finally sort of being shone on the work that needs to be done. So from that, what I am observing is there's this growing desire for organizations to either incorporate some sort of culturally specific or appropriate services and supports for Indigenous people. But even more so, I think, from the Calgary perspective, I'm also seeing a desire for organizations to take a similar approach that the Calgary Foundation is. So not only designing programs that help to support Indigenous people that are culturally appropriate, that are not oppressive, but to actually change how they function, the structure of their organization. So there's this framework that I sort of follow called the Wheel of Change. Yeah, the Wheel of Change by Robert Glass. And he talks about 3 organizational phases of life, and that's first the people and their behaviors. Those 2 things really impact the structure of the organization, and it aligns with our approach of embedding some really deep context in our systems change. So we're impacting a person's heart and their mind by amplifying historical context. I think when people think of the residential school system, it's so easy for someone to sort of disregard it or regard it as something that happened in the past. But little do they know that it has such deep implications on today's contemporary times. And so I'm seeing that growing desire from organizations. So yeah.
Yeah, this generational impact that I think certainly people who were in the Indigenous communities the public at large didn't quite comprehend in the way that they should have, including those that would be some of the settler-led uh, foundations and charitable organizations. Over the and I sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's fair. I was just going to point out an example of what that looks like. So, in the work that I do and the conversations that I'm trying to facilitate, I'm really trying to get people to think deeply about um, not only their roles as individuals and what they're responsible for, but how they are a part of these larger systems and how they can sort of really speak to some of that change. And it's not, I heard a lady from the United States who does work in equity talk about this, that there's this notion of being too woke. So when people are like working towards equity, whether it's racial equity, equity for other communities, definitely for reconciliation, when when the perception or the optics are that people are having such a strong focus and they're resourcing the work and they're doing all of this change to the dominant culture narrative, I think they're a little bit threatened. It's just like, what do we have to give up in order for this to happen? And so there's this, this phrasing of being too woke. And this lady in the States who does this work in equity really like what she said. She said, we're not becoming too woke as a society. As a society, we are maturing, and we are sort of realizing that there's treatment towards specific groups of people that just isn't tolerable anymore. And I like what you said about generational change, because I absolutely agree with that. I think our generation right now is tasked with this truth-telling movement. And not only doing a Google search, not only doing that online, course that talks about Indigenous issues, but really sort of understanding, doing some sense making behind how that historical, work has impacted our communities, how it still has socioeconomic challenges, and how we sort of live in this world. And and if you are an individual or organization who's pushing for that, don't stop and don't quit. I think it's so easy to get discouraged, but each and every time I do something or I hold space for that kind of learning and unlearning, people come up to me and they say, "Okay, Tim, I finally get it. My knowledge has increased. I have I feel like I have the language to do something, but what do I do? What is next?" And I'll say that that's problematic for two reasons. The first reason is you're putting that responsibility back on those who are already oppressed to tell you what to do. And secondly, if you can tell that person without a doubt in your mind that every single person within your spheres of influence, when it relates to your families, your friends, and your colleagues, has that same level of knowledge, and the answer is no, then that's what's next. We have to really experience this truth-telling movement. We are the generation tasked to set up the conditions and the knowledge and the understanding so that reconciliation can happen for this younger leadership. I do believe that a new kind of leadership is emerging in the younger generation, that they are not afraid to talk about this kind of stuff. And in fact, sometimes with a lot of these movements that are going on, it's coming from younger people. So I think we have a lot to learn from this younger generation, but that's what we're tasked to do.
That sets the context so well, because since those really pivotal moments that you talked about happened during the pandemic, over the past several years, we've seen that research has shown that prior to recent changes, that a very small percentage of funding has been going to Indigenous-led organizations. And I wonder what you have seen in this regard during your career in the nonprofit sector.
Yeah, well, definitely that realization as well. So I think that adds to the growing desire of people are finally getting to the understanding that this wealth distribution we are so proud of, and the very generous people that we work with who have interest areas in supporting this work, is maintaining itself. But we need to understand that there is a big portion of the population that is not benefiting from that generational wealth, and the other big part of the story behind that we have to reconcile is, if we want to like really dig deep down, that generational wealth comes off of the lands and the backs of Indigenous communities. So in a way, here we are doing land acknowledgements, doing all this kind of stuff, acknowledging the very people that we know are suffering, and So not to say that there's this guilt-driven force behind it, but there's a lot of truth that we are realizing. And so what I have seen in recent years, just from some of the amazing grantors and funders that I get to work with from time to time, is they're either restructuring their application processes to make it a lot less rigorous, rigid for specifically Indigenous communities to access funds. We're also trying to, what I see is we're trying to increase the awareness of our granting opportunities to Indigenous communities. For example, when I started at the foundation, we had not to my understanding, been able to provide a grant to any First Nations community within the Treaty 7 area, just because they didn't really know who we were. My good friend and colleague Chris Archie at the Circle talks about in that pandemic time when we were responding to community needs, all of a sudden there's this big interest to reach out to Indigenous communities, and so to a certain degree they were being bombarded by help, and it's just like, we're trying to maintain the safety of our people just as much as you are. We really don't have time to sit down and build a relationship right now, and why now? So I hope what we have observed and experienced really sets us on a path to be a lot more proactive than reactive in those situations.
Well, I guess looking at the most recent years, do you feel that any progress is being made? Have the recent legislative changes around working with non-qualified donees made an impact on being able to, I guess, work with more um, community-based, Indigenous-led organizations that are making the decisions on the ground to help their communities?
I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that it will. I think it's too early to tell right now. um, I know that the legislative changes that have occurred are now sort of in the hands of the organization, so they have to set up their own. They have to restructure their own processes, which is something that we're also doing. Um, so it's too early to tell if that change has made a significant difference. What I do know is that um, it's in part on a lot of the charities, and I'm in Montreal right now. I just have come off of 2 days supporting some of this work with the Pathy Foundation, and um, you know, just by the fact that there's other foundations reaching out and have this area of focus and interest is exciting to me. It's promising. The real sort of test whether or not that's going to make a difference is if they are adjusting, revising, or creating some sort of sightline for Indigenous communities to access their grant funding or their opportunities. Um, we know through the pandemic and how quickly we were able to respond, how flexible we were able to be in those really hard times, that it is possible. So I think, historically it's like, well, we really can't do this. We can't do this because of this policy. And it's just like, well, we just proved through a whole global health crisis that we can actually make the change that we need to do. And so it's through podcasts like this, it's through, conversations like this, through dialogue like this, that we really have to push that and have them realize, no, there is something that you can do. What is stopping you is this unconscious bias for whatever reason. If they're not doing anything, but I don't really see that blatantly happening. I see more of an upswing, and I see more support or interest in supporting, and which is then leading to behavioral change, which is then leading to, okay, we need to sort of change this application process. It's kind of problematic and all that kind of stuff. So overall, I see it's incremental, but when you want to do things right, I think you need to take the time, and you need to involve the community as well. Involving the community, you might experience some sort of resistance, some kind of resistance. And I said this, I think, last time when we spoke, that I'm trying to encourage people to look at resistance as a positive thing, and that resistance often has a negative connotation. But that resistance that you might be feeling from the Indigenous community isn't a reflection of yourself as a person. It's a reflection of who you represent, and who you represent historically has not been very nice to Indigenous people, specifically when it comes down to taking children away, intentionally setting up legislation and laws so that there's a cultural disruption to how they live in this world. where we're still feeling the impacts. Just a few years ago, or I think 2 or 3 years ago, at the Canov Center, we launched an Indigenous oral practices policy, where before we could not bring in elders to support our work, to light medicine and all that kind of stuff, because it was a safety hazard, all this kind of stuff. So um, they need to know that that stuff is really harmful. Like, we can't even go to work and be our true authentic selves because of things like that, because of mindsets like that. And it's not because of these fire policies, but it's these fire policies and these things that they use as mechanisms to, continue to stop that work. But once we pull out things like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, where Article 11 says we have the right now to be who we are, to do all this kind of stuff, and then we lean on the TRC. And so we have to sort of, it's still a big fight to get to that place of equality. But for the most part, I think we're finding the courage in ourselves to have those conversations, and there's some significant change happening.
So you mentioned some of the things that the Calgary Foundation is doing. I'd like to hear a little bit more what your experience has been at the Calgary Foundation. What's the foundation working on to do a better job of getting funding to Indigenous-led organizations?
Well, we're staying consistent in what we have always promised to do since we began to focus on this area, and that's just to maintain a relationship with the surrounding Treaty 7 communities, including the Métis Nation communities, and the Indigenous-led charities in and around the urban center of Calgary. I say Indigenous-led just because there are tons of other non-Indigenous agencies and organizations that are providing Indigenous-specific supports, and that's a really exciting thing as well. That's always existed. The difference was the amount of support that the non-Indigenous agencies providing Indigenous-specific supports were receiving versus an Indigenous-led organization. And I feel like if we can get to a place where that's a little bit more balanced, that's what I would like to see. At the Calgary Foundation, we continue to convene seasonally an Indigenous network gathering that brings together charities, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous charities, but they need to sort of have a focused area on creating Indigenous-specific supports for the work that they do, engaging in some sort of systems change process around reconciliation, similar to what we're doing, or be Indigenous-led themselves. We continue to gather seasonally. We come together. We do not practice any kind of Robert's Rule of Order. Any kind of colonial way of gathering and meeting is thrown out the window. We're sitting in circle. We're being our true selves. We're incorporating medicine. We're sitting in dialogue, and we're healing together. We are, laughing together. We're just being in right relations. And I think if I could broadcast one of those meetings and show the world what it's like to really convene and be in that space, this is what we're trying to work to. We're trying to work to this holistic attitude, this way of life that really honors what it means to be in relationship with each other, with the land and spirituality, to really show what it means to be Indigenous. That's where we get our strength from. So we convene that group of people. We're able to sort of share the things that we're doing, share opportunities that are coming. Not only us, but everyone else gets to share with themselves. So I think a big part of our philanthropy is trying to look at giving that goes beyond money. And, if we can create a space and have people give their knowledge to one another, we're going to do that. When it comes to the granting side of things, I was really happy to, learn that our major and signature grants committee was the first committee ever to give $1 million grant to a First Nations reserve, which is the blood reserve for the Red Crow Community College build, since we last spoke. And every community cycle, I'm just really happy to see more and more applications coming from First Nations communities. They're beginning to understand, and the relationship is growing and strengthening. That's what we're doing at the Calgary Foundation. And I know other funders, partners at Calgary Arts Development are doing some innovative things to their application processes, specifically to support Indigenous-led charities and projects. The United Ways, I know, are doing really good things. They're convening their own advisors from the community, some knowledge keepers, all that kind of stuff. And I am a part of some of those communities myself. So Trellis here in Calgary convenes a group of us just to come in and advise them on some of the supports that they're doing. And not only like, what's really exciting is in a lot of these spaces, and probably because we're pushing for this, is we don't want to silo this work. We don't want to be this indigenous group of people working towards change over here. How is it that we're impacting the whole organization? How is it that what we're giving you in terms of our knowledge, how are you mobilizing that? We talk about this notion of knowledge extraction versus knowledge mobilization. And I'm really vocal about this, that if you're inviting us into these spaces simply to increase your level of understanding, you're being no less extractive than efforts before you. And I'm talking about the extraction in land, extraction in resources, extraction in children. You know, it's what you do with that knowledge that really makes a difference. And that's, to us, that's knowledge mobilization.
Well, I sure would like to give you an opportunity to broadcast those meetings. I think it would be marvelous. But I think you're right. There are a lot of other organizations that do want to both increase their funding to Indigenous-led organizations, but also change the way in which they function internally, but in collaboration with Indigenous groups. What advice would you give to other foundations who want to increase their funding and change in a positive way the way that they work with Indigenous people?
I mean, I don't mean to like stand here and say this is what they have to do and this is the solution. I've never tried to take that stance. I know everything that we've done at the foundation has really been based on experimentation. We lean on a lot of systems change ideologies. So our friends at the Trico Changemaker Studio help us deliver a systems change retreat every year called Active Reconciliation. It's coming up in October. And we always invite a charity into that space, a charity or two. And in the past, we've had charities like Calgary Legal Guidance, Fort Calgary, which is not Fort Calgary anymore. They changed their name. Um, Trellis has been there. Hall Homes. Tons of agencies have come over the past. This is our 5th year entering into the system change retreat. I can say that it's pretty transformational. We're not only talking about systems change, but we're also incorporating levels of what it looks like to be anti-oppressive, what it looks like to be culturally appropriate. To me, that's really listening to the community. There's 2 lead facilitators on that team. That's Elder Casey Eagle Speaker and Evelyn Goodstriker. A few years ago, we asked the same question that you're asking me now to Deandra Brewstead, who's a counselor on the Blood Reserve. We wanted to find out if, our approaches were making a difference to the Blood Reserve, and she said absolutely. And the advice that she gave us and to share with others was listen to community. First of all, reach out to them. If you're experiencing that resistance, don't stop. Understand that, and I think I say that because a lot of times and too often people say, well, we reached out to them, we didn't get anything, or we did and nothing. It's just like, yeah, but don't stop. That's resistance. You realize you're experiencing resistance. But if you're doing the learning that you say you're doing, then you know that they're impacted negatively by this very approach. So of course you're going to get that response. But don't stop, continue to learn from it. That's how you mobilize the knowledge. I'll give you another example of where I don't think knowledge was mobilized was this recent water crisis in Calgary where we couldn't drink the water. And there was leader after leader going on their social media advocating for Calgarians to monitor their drinking water, which I think it was a really noble effort. But these are the same leaders who are learning about the TRC and know about the water crisis happening on First Nations communities. They were not using that platform. They could have talked about 2 water crises happening, but they weren't mobilizing that knowledge. They were prioritizing the well-being of one group of people over another when they had a perfect opportunity to do both at the same time.
That is a really striking comparison, and I can't agree with you more. It's a terrible shame of Canada that we've allowed this crisis to continue to exist across Canada in so many communities of Indigenous people. It's a disgrace, really. Um, I'd like to turn to learning more about the Indigenous Ally Toolkit that was created by the Calgary Foundation. In your opinion, what does it mean for a nonprofit organization or an individual working in the sector to be an ally?
Well, first, I have to make a clarification there. So we adapted that toolkit, and it was developed by the Urban Indigenous Strategy of Montreal, which I'm here right now. I was able to meet the folks and learn about their revamping, they're updating the toolkit, which I'm hoping to do the same for ours. In the past and moving forward, and now, I always try to encourage people not to aspire to be an ally. That shouldn't be your motivation. Your motivation should come from the fact and the realization that severe genocide has occurred. Attempts at assimilation and oppression continues to happen today, and you're inspired to right the wrongs of that past and change the trajectory in the future for the well-being of Indigenous people. It's your actions that show your allyship status, not the fact that you want to be an ally. Allies are needed, but it's this context that we want to really try to shift and change.
And what are your thoughts on how the nonprofit sector can help to advance reconciliation work? Uh, I think what you've just said is really it's action, it's not talk, and we've had a lot too much talk for a very long time. Is that kind of what you want to say to the wider nonprofit sector?
Hmm. I would tell them, I would ask them not to stop talking. I would tell them to continue to talk about it. There's, as much as we are doing these things, there's still a lack of understanding when it happens. They're doing it because they're seeing it being done. But do they really understand what it's like? And so part of my time with this foundation here in Montreal was talking about the significance of land acknowledgement and the resources that we have developed, the journey that we went on, and the context that we're providing um, within our racial equity learning plan on the land acknowledgement slide that we often share in those experiences is that now that we're knowledgeable about this history, it implicates us to do something. Now we know better. We have to do better, but that doesn't mean that we have to stop talking about it. And I think when it comes to more action, I think if they can begin to really look at the structure of what makes them an organization, do a deep dive into their organizational script. Um, there's opportunities, and when they look at this work, I don't want them to be overwhelmed by they talk about the challenges. One of our brave space principles in our space is seeing those challenges as possibilities. How can they sort of shift the way they think about these challenges as actually possibilities? And once that happens, I think they will begin to see that's a leverage point for them to realize specific policy change that has to happen. I think a big one is, bereavement policy. I think we all have bereavement policy, but are they considering a family concept when it comes to Indigenous people? And are they adjusting that bereavement policy so that, our family goes beyond what the dominant culture would view as that nuclear family? And we have traditional moms and dads and siblings who experience loss, or we're experiencing the loss of them, sometimes, one after the other. And this bereavement policy wouldn't support us taking the time off that we need to heal with our communities, because it's so specific on the relationship that you have to have with someone that you've lost. Things like that. That's just one example of a structural policy that can change. But if organizations can have the bravery to, and I want to say this, a big level to an organization that can either hinder or support and move this work forward is that board of director level. And if that board of director level is not open to being a part of this work, if they aren't understanding that it's not easy to measure the success of a changing system by numbers or by surveys, and that's all they're used to seeing, they have so much power that they have the ability to stop it. So it's not just the organizations, it's the leadership that has that big influence on these organizations as well. And quite frankly, I'm not sure if I would be here doing the work that I'm doing had it not been for John Fisher, who was the only Indigenous board member on the Calgary Foundation at the time that I was hired, who took the lead on taking that board through a snapshot of this understanding that inspired them to be like, wow, what are we doing and what are we not doing, more importantly? So it really opened up their eyes, gave me that sort of foot in the door to begin this work and to remain consistent in it. So it's the whole organization. It's every single actor that makes up that organization. That's the approach I've always taken. Because I was in the beginning asked, do you want to start your own specific Indigenous fund? Do you want to create your own Indigenous grants committee? And I said, no, like that's siloing the work. I want to hire more. I want to bring on more Indigenous volunteers as grant committee viewers, but I want to seed them throughout every committee. And, same thing with our staff and our board representation. So since then, we've seen that growing diversity of perspectives, and it's making a huge difference. We're actually impacting internal systems change, because that wheel of change suggests that once a person's heart and their mind are shifted, their behavior is going to change, and then that behavior will lead to some of that structural change. And it's easy for me to say that because I'm involved in the work on a day-to-day basis, but I don't know if I would have been as confident in having that perspective 3 years ago when we first spoke, Mary, to now that I see some of that, the needle is shifting. We're experiencing something's happening towards the direction of what I think reconciliation can be. And so for other organizations, it's tough. Yes, it requires resourcing. But really, when it comes down to it, what is stopping you? What is stopping you is a question that I would encourage people to ask. And things are going to come up, well, I don't know enough. I'm afraid. When they really dig deep down individually, they'll surface some of the things that are really stopping them, that there's a hesitation happening there. And the ability for them to overcome that by speaking to people who are, experienced or doing this kind of work, I think will really benefit them. Find yourself in community. I get a lot of requests to support relationship building, and that question, and part of my sort of humor is I wish I had a Tim Fox to reach out to when I was doing this work, but I didn't. I literally found myself in community. I found myself in places and spaces where I knew that they were going to be. So if there are non-Indigenous leaders who are part of the dominant culture, find yourself in places and spaces where you're the minority. It's the best way you're going to learn. It's the best way you're going to, and to continue to find yourself in those places and spaces to build relationships. For when people struggle to pronounce the names of communities when it comes to land acknowledgement, I guarantee you spend some time with those community members, you will be saying that word no problem. But they just don't do the work. It's as simple as that. Just spend time.
Well, it's so interesting in talking to other people, other Indigenous leaders for this episode. I heard two things that I'm hearing from you. One is the importance of including leadership in this work, and the importance of building relationships. And that takes time. And being humble in order to open up those communications and being able to change and be honest about past lack of success or inaction, and moving forward in a different way. So it's really interesting to hear you observe that as well. What are your thoughts on how the nonprofit sector can help to advance reconciliation work? Do you think that the nonprofit can play a critical role for society in a more broad sense?
Yeah, I think there's a section in the Truth and Reconciliation 94 Calls to Action report that is before the calls to action are actually addressed. And it's this executive summary where I think where the commissioners had a big piece in writing some of that stuff. That piece of the report is the piece that I lean on the most as a framework to help develop our strategic direction of creating a really strong learning plan. And then, but not just like a talking head, but like, how are you making this learning visceral? How are you making it so that participants are actually feeling what it's like? Because I guarantee you, if you're a person without lived experience and we're sitting here talking about our trauma and the things that we have to do, you're not going to understand. You're just not going to get it. You're not going to get it. So for these leaders and these not-for-profit agencies, if you can find an opportunity to engage some learning, relearning, unlearning, and do it again and again and again in a way that involves a person's physical body, their emotions, their sensations, it's the only way that system is going to change. And Eva, my boss, in the beginning of this work, really believed and encouraged me, Tim, one of the crucial ways to change a system is when you shift attitudes and beliefs. You think about it, historically, there's been a really negative attitude and belief about Indigenous people. And now even in today's society, there's that same kind of perspective on racialized communities. Once that's shifted, though, a big part of our context in our racial equity learning plan that was co-developed by Shaliza Ledhani and Stephanie Tyler and Ayodeji is going back to imperialism, colonization, understanding what those two things were, and then taking another historical look at the world over and how they emerged, specifically in Canada, was a Chinese head tax. Racism, there was technologies that were used to support racism very intentionally. That was erasure, surveillance, all of these things that had regulations on who you were and what you could and couldn't do. That's something that's big, that's sort of still impacting us today. So look at these actions that are happening. Look at racism as a technology. What were the technologies that were being used? Really learn about that stuff. And that's what a leader has to do. That's what these leaders have to do. That's what leadership requires. And leadership requires to look at the whole scope, not just a siloed perspective. I was a part of the Map the System competition this past year, and James Stotch reminded us that this day and age, we are tackling all sorts of issues, from climate change to racial inequality to reconciliation. But they continue to persist. Why do they continue to persist when we have a countless number of organizations handling any given issue at one time? We probably have the most educated population. We probably have the most, from Western standards, the most educated population in human history. We pour millions of dollars into research and policy change. And why do they persist? It's because, Mary and everyone, we are trained and conditioned to look through our areas of discipline. That's not what systems change is about. It's about going beyond what you have been trained and educated to do for. Everything that I've been doing at the Calgary Foundation that has contributed to a shift that I think that I'm seeing, I've not learned in formal education. I've learned through the people with lived experience after that education was done. The experiences that I went through as a child on the Blood Reserve, being raised by two residential school survivors who were dealing with their own issues, and I was the oldest child witnessing all of that. It was really hard. But now I could look back and call it something. That time in my life was the time that has contributed to my knowledge about what needs to change more so than any kind of formal education. And I always tell students that I present to, don't let schooling interfere with your education, especially when it comes to systems change for this kind of work. So, they have to go outside the box, connect with people with lived experience, and support the learning, the really deep, crucial, significant learning, like I said, that impacts a person's heart and their mind. It is tough, but we have so many supports in place. And I think, just as this woman talks about in the States, that we are maturing as a society. And if you can parallel that visualization to a child having a tantrum versus a child who sort of gets why they can't do something. There's this understanding. I think historically, when we were doing this work and people fought against it, it was just the child having a tantrum. I think we're getting to the realization where, thankfully, we know that it's wrong and that it still continues to happen and they still continue to persist. And I say that when you ask the question about what we have been doing, that we remain consistent. Too often do people start something, they realize that maybe it isn't having the impact that they want to see, and they stop and do it. But they're using their own sort of bias to measure the success of that. And I don't think that that's a really impactful, effective approach.
So, looking ahead to the next few years, after this, I think, change that you've spoken to, that has happened during the pandemic and some of these really pivotal kind of events that occurred, do you feel optimistic that Indigenous-led organizations will be receiving higher percentages of funding and fundraising dollars? Do you think that there'll be better work in terms of collaborating with Indigenous-led organizations? And what work do you think that the wider nonprofit sector needs to do to be a better partner and to collaborate better with Indigenous communities and organizations?
Looking ahead, I really don't think about that. I don't think about the money. I know that I know that money is needed to do this kind of work. I don't know what the other leaders, responded to when it came to this question. I just want our communities to be healthy. I want them to be thriving and well-being. I know that things have to change. Some things do have to change on the part of non-Indigenous community members and just society overall in order for that to happen. If it's money, then I think that those resources should be given to that change that has to happen. I think we've proven ourselves enough, and um, we continue to sort of have to justify the means behind why we're experiencing these challenges when it's the rest of Canada that has to reconcile with that. This isn't by our own doing, but yet we are the ones that are responsible for doing it. And um, just take philanthropy, for example, and its wealth generation. If you own land in this country, have you reconciled from where that land has come from? Who is suffering because you have that today? Think about that. But don't be motivated by guilt. Be motivated and learn from the Indigenous community. We don't want, or take. We're humble in this approach. We realize that we're here together. We want to live in collaboration and peaceful and right relationships. That lesson should be taught to everyone when they see a person or an Indigenous elder have such a close, strong relationship to plants and animals and things. It's not about that relationship, it's about the respect. The lesson there is about respect for these things. And in that same spirit, we have respect for everyone else. That's what we want.
Well, Tim, I'm so grateful for your very wise counsel and your insight into what you've experienced, but also what you're seeing changing and what needs to continue to change in terms of the nonprofit sector doing a better job to support the work of reconciliation and to support Indigenous communities. Appreciate your advice to nonprofits and charities in Canada, as they navigate their own reconciliation journeys and seek better ways to support Indigenous-led organizations and be a better partner with Indigenous communities. Thank you for joining us on Charity Village Connects.
Thank you again for having me.